First of all, welcome to Musicmas. Welcome to Musicmas show. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. One of the common theme in pretty much all your roles has been your understanding of complexity science and how you used it. Can you tell us where you got first you introduced to it and how you took to it so well?
Many of my interests are in diverse fields. And so I have been very intrigued by the idea of random shocks, the fact that there's a huge amount of uncertainty in the world, and the sheer impossibility of being able to tell how the world will pan out. And you expect decisions to take ex ante without having any idea how things will pan out. And in fact, as we speak, we are in a particularly difficult point of time, as you know. And in fact, as we just discussed, we will have to cut this significantly short so that I can get back to other things. But the point here is very simple. Too much of the theory of how to take decisions, how to think about the world, are based on what I call is the idea of predestiny of some sort. This is there everywhere. Whether it's in of course, left-wing Marxist theology, which talks about history having a particular path, works through dialectics. Now, that's one extreme. But even in so-called more rational sort of management sciences, you are taught all these very, almost Soviet ideas of business plans. But in fact, the world is extremely uncertain. We are obviously, this particular pandemic we're going through is the biggest shock that we have had since in the last 100 years, maybe. But the point of the matter is, it is not as if the world was in equilibrium before this.
Yep.
If you go a decade before this, we had the great financial crisis. And at that time, we thought, that was the worst possible shock. But if you went back a decade before that, you had the Asian crisis and the dot-com bubble blow up. Or if you went back a further decade before that, you had the falling of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR. All of these are completely cataclysmic events nobody predicted. So when you're taking decisions or designing systems, something struck me very much was that we spend so much time trying to plan, whereas in fact, what you need to do is to do scenario analysis and adaptation. So this is the context in which I have been thinking about the world, is that really what it is about is hedging yourself against the worst possible outcomes and adapting along the way.
So clearly we are in the midst of this pandemic, and it's not speaking about it seems we feel guilty even not speaking about it. All of us are so deeply affected by it. When there is so much nonlinearity in history, why is it so difficult to learn from that nonlinearity from history and apply it? I mean, we constantly see ourselves getting surprised by the next one that happens. What's your perspective?
I don't know the psychology of this, but it is the case that we have this inner need for certainty. And so we hanker for it in multiple ways. We will see patterns in the skies, for example. I think one of the earliest examples of this will be astrology. We can clearly see defined patterns in the sky. Now, obviously, the movement of the stars and the planets is a Newtonian system. So yes, it has certain patterns. Then what we do is we reflect it back into our own lives and say, why does this not have the same kind of patterns? Now, the problem is that one is a Newtonian system and the other is a chaotic, complex system. They're different things and they follow a different logic. But because enough of things in our lives follow these Newtonian patterns, we always keep wishing that we could also do the same thing in our own lives. And so I think there is this innate dissonance. And I'll tell you, this whole field of economics, for example, is oddly enough derived entirely from Newtonian mechanics. People don't realize this, but the underlying structure of conventional economics is entirely Newtonian mechanics. That's why you hear terms like, levers of monetary or fiscal power policy. You'll hear terms like liquidity, which is a hydraulic term, and so on. And there is this idea that, the economy is one gigantic machine running on fixed rails, and those fixed rails are called the trend line, if you wish. And then if it's going too fast, then you pull the brake. If it's not going fast enough, you shovel in some more coal into the machine. So that is the mental image we have. It is heavily dependent on this way of thinking that there has to be a sort of order and we must be able to control this. And people love this to such an extent. We so like this idea of control that even when we can blatantly see that we do not have control, we begin to see these patterns when there are none. So this is something called the lamppost effect, by the way. And so, yeah, so you know that the ring hasn't fallen below the lamppost, but you
want to look for it.
Lamppost because there's better light there.
Sure.
So we get blindsided by this all the time. So, for example, you'll keep seeing, by the way, Nassim Taleb talks a lot about this and he calls this the fooled by randomness.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have enough monkeys throwing darts, some of them will hit the bullseye, and then you see, at least some of the monkeys knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
But actually, none of them knew what they were doing. So we need to begin to think of the world in fundamentally different ways. And when we begin to do that, by the way you respond, the heroes and villains become quite different.
You've been thinking about the application of complexity science in the science of cities. And we've, you've elaborated quite nicely in your book. Given what's happening to us with the pandemic, do you think we should change the way we think about cities, the way we think about density and density of population, and what will be the role of healthcare in cities? Because clearly, it seems that the cities were the most affected in what just happened to us.
See, my entire thesis is the following: that the way things evolve are not going to follow any patterns that we and I let out. Whether that happens to be a pattern that I am, setting because I think it's good. The point is that pattern is not predetermined. By the way, if cities are inefficient by densifying people for the purposes of a pandemic, there are many other things for which is actually far more efficient. For example, from an environmental perspective. So from another perspective of another possible catastrophic breakdown, it is better because cities are vastly more efficient as users of energy than, say, spread out suburbia. So point is, I am not going to take the planning approach would be to try and decide that this is the right model and force everybody onto it. I, on the other hand, would take the view that, look, what is the correct model depends very much on the technology of the time, the social structure of the time, and so on. I have no way of judging what that will be. For example, it may well be that, it's more efficient in the future to live in small cities simply because not just pandemics, but because we are doing all of this online. Why do you need to live in a big city anyway? So till this pandemic, the technology situation was such that the efficiency of living in a very large city was the best thing to do because you didn't have to travel very large distance to meet people. But supposing you don't need to meet people anymore, and most of our lives are now going to be led in the way we are now having this conversation, then yes, then everybody can live wherever they want. And so maybe that factor basically dissolves. I have no way of knowing this. Maybe another technological change will also change this. But the point I'm making here is, I am agnostic to this. What I'm much more interested is in managing this process correctly. So let me differentiate here between planning and managing transitions. because they are two different things. So let me explain this using cities. So very often people think that, the best planned city in India is Chandigarh and the best planned city in the world is Singapore. So they must be basically, if Chandigarh is better run, it will become Singapore, right? But in fact, they are opposite models. Chandigarh is essentially following the same Le Corbusier's plan that was set over half a century ago. And so consequently, it doesn't evolve at all. One could argue that it's basically a subsidy scheme for retired and serving bureaucrats. To the extent Chandigarh shows any zing, it happens outside the plan in Mohali, right? Now, Singapore, on the other hand, continuously changes. The founding fathers of Singapore in 1965, when it became independent, Lee Kuan Yew, would not quite have known how Singapore was going to later on turn out to be. So Lee Kuan Yew of 1965 would not be able to make his way around 2021 Singapore. Just wouldn't know where to go, which is completely different. But Le Corbusier of 1965 would know exactly where to go in Chandigarh. Why? Because Singapore has been continuously evolving. So what we are confusing as rigid master planning or having this great plan that was laid out by Singapore and then executed is actually a case of good transition management. They did not have a plan in the beginning. They still do not have a plan. I've been myself a part of this, their sort of planning process, if that's what you call it. But it's completely different from what we do. Yeah. What we do is master plan. What we do is we envisage an endpoint. And then our idea is we should implement to reach that endpoint as well as we can. So when things don't work out, people will say, "Dekhiye, plan bahut acha tha, lekin implementation theek se nahi."
Implementation.
Very often you'll hear this. Whereas in Singapore, there is no meaningful distinction.
Yeah.
It's about continuous transition management.
Yeah, the plan is transition management.
Yes, plan is transition management. If you want to call it.
That's a phenomenal insight.
And this distinction, let me just finish. Once you distinguish between these two things, you understand that Gurgaon, better managed, is likelier to become Singapore than anything you do with Chandigarh.
I think it's pretty very insightful. And by the way, this applies a lot to many of the Fortune 500 companies that we work with, who have who pay a huge price for seeking certainty. And in that is this constant perspective towards planning rather than transition management, if I may say. But having said what you just said, you also lay out this concept of software of a city. So how do I reconcile the fact that, it's all about transition management, but then you still bring the concept of software, which to me, as a computer science person, makes me feel that there is some sort of encoding that has happened before.
Yeah, so here you need to understand, what do I mean by software? Software relates to the human capital, the institutions, the governance structures, all the soft stuff, not apart from the hard infrastructure, buildings, etc., that you can feel and touch. A city is made up of relationships, trust systems, institutions of various kinds, as I said, skills, human capital, all the soft things that make up a city. In fact, just like in a computer, the real game is the software.
Yeah.
Hardware is there merely to allow the software to inhabit it.
And to your point, actually, the software of today is constantly in transition management.
Yes, and in fact, it's always in transition. After all, you do it in your own computer, you're upgrading it all the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You're uploading apps, you're deleting apps. Those apps, even if you're keeping them, are getting upgraded. All kinds of things are happening. Nobody thinks that's a strange thing.
Yeah.
Right? And at some point, your hand phone becomes unable to keep up with the new software, and you have to get yourself a new hardware.
Yeah.
Now, there is nothing that you could have done in 1965 with your large, room-sized computers to be able to do what we can now do in a small pocket smartphone.
Sure.
Right? So therefore, you had to continuously upgrade it, right? So why do we suddenly think that we can have these grand master plans that are going to work? It's not possible to make it work because it's not possible to anybody to know how this will evolve. And by the way, let me now connect all of this to what is going on in the COVID response, because I know this is at the back of everybody's mind. So I need you to understand that this is also complex. The response is complexity based. And if there are failings, then it has to be still fixed within this complexity framework. We can't fix it by having what many people say, better planning.
I mean, I'm completely bought into what you're saying. And I would actually go on to say that the difference between founders who own their companies versus professional CEOs who kind of constantly are seeking justification for their presence in that company, that justification, need for justification comes in the way of them being okay with being slapped around. And therefore, this high propensity for planning. Now is the time to just wish you luck and wish all of us luck. It's a difficult time for all of us. And I think what you laid out today as the difference between planning versus transition management is a very, very important life lesson. Thank you so much for spending time today with us. I'm hoping that we can continue to have more dialogues with you. It's been a pleasure for me to be speaking to you.
Thank you and namaskar.